I happen to be an English major in school, and something that's been coming up more and more, especially if you're in school right now as well, is how much AI has started to show up in work, or everyday academic work even. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, I'm not trying to be like, oh, it's going to take over everything and all of us way, but it's doing it kind of in this quiet and constant way where there's always an option to use it in the background. And I'm saying this as someone who's focused on English. That's my major. And that's where a lot of work is based around writing, reading, and trying to develop your own way of expressing ideas, which makes this whole thing feel a bit more complicated than it might in other areas, such as math or something. Because on one hand, AI tools can be genuinely useful. If you're stuck on wording something, or you need help organizing your thoughts, like brainstorming, or even just getting started when you don't know how to begin something. That kind of support can make things a lot easier in a way that feels helpful and not too harmful. But at the same time, there's this other side of it where it starts to change how you approach the work itself. Instead of struggling through an idea or figuring out how to phrase something on your own, there's always an option to just skip that part. Just go into an AI and give it the prompt and say, hey, word it this way, have this kind of tone, and it just starts spitting out the information. And that's where it starts to feel a bit off for me, especially in something like English, where that's my specialization, where the process of writing is kind of the whole point. It's not just the final result that's important, but the whole process that you go through, all your different revisions, your different versions, and so on. When you're writing an essay, in the later stages of English, it's not really just about producing the piece of text itself, but also about going through your process of thinking, revising, gradually shaping your ideas into something clearer, and a lot of that only happens because it's a little difficult. And if that difficulty gets removed or reduced too much with AI and such, then you're not really engaging with the same process anymore, even if the final product looks fine on the surface. And I think that's one of the main concerns. Not that AI will replace writing or replace people entirely, but that it can quietly take over parts of the process that are actually very important for learning and giving yourself your unique voice and your unique skills and talents. And it does that in a way that's very easy to justify in the moment, but in the long term, not so much. It's very easy to say, well, I would love to save X amount of time and just not do this. But in the long run, I feel like it really pays off that you acquire these skills and have the practice and have the knowledge behind it. It's really easy to tell yourself you're just using it as a tool, just getting a little help, just smoothing things out. And each individual use doesn't seem like a big deal, but over time, if you're constantly relying on it and just using it for basically everything, it can really put you in a bad situation where you have to rely on it more than you realize. And this reliance can make it harder to develop your own voice because you're not fully working through your ideas on your own terms. Instead, you're kind of filtering them through something else. And that doesn't mean that you lose your voice completely, but it can make it much less distinct and much slower to develop if you even end up developing it at all, because you're not really directly practicing the skill anymore. And another thing that comes up a lot is the issue of originality, because when you're writing something yourself, even if it's not perfect, it definitely reflects your own way of thinking, your own choices, your own interpretation of whatever you're working on, and so on. But when AI gets involved, even in the smaller ways, it can start to kind of blur that line a bit, because now it's not entirely clear where your input ends and where the tool's input begins. And that can make the work feel a lot less personal. Even if it still technically meets the requirements of your assignment, it's not going to give you the skills and the knowledge and the experience necessary to keep going. And then there's the classroom side of it, which is a bit more complicated because teachers are trying to figure out how to respond to this at the same time that students are trying to figure out how to use it. And that creates this kind of tension where expectations aren't always clear. How much assistance is what counts as your work? What counts as not your work? How do you even define that when tools like this exist? And so you end up in situations where people are either overly cautious or not cautious at all because there isn't really a consistent understanding of where the boundary can actually begin. And that uncertainty makes the whole experience feel a bit strange because instead of just focusing on the work, you're also thinking about how the work is being evaluated in relation to these tools. And one thing that kind of worries me is a false kind of detection. What if you write something on your own, but they see it as something AI, or another machine they use to scan it sees it as AI, and then you get a terrible grade or you get accused of cheating, which actually happened to me once. even though you wrote it yourself. There was once a time I had written out a pretty nice paper all on my own, and I was accused of using AI for it, and I had to fight and push back and show a bunch of documents and things that showed my whole editing process. And I'm glad that I kept several documents of my editing process, my notes, and everything else, because it would have been hard to prove otherwise, because they were pretty convinced that I was using AI for an assignment that I wasn't. And it kind of really bothered me, because it shows that even those who are honest are now getting accused, and those who are trying very hard to avoid using AI still get accused just because of a false detection, or the professor gets a little overly suspicious. So it must be hard for professors, and they probably feel like they have to walk around eggshells for it. And of course, if they get pushback, they don't want to immediately fold. They don't want to immediately admit that they could be wrong, so they'll probably fight you a little bit on it, because I remember having to fight quite a bit before I was able to get it across and show enough proof that convinced the professor. And another thing that doesn't get talked about as much is how it affects your confidence, because if you start relying on AI for certain parts of your writing, it could probably really make you second guess your own ability when you're not using AI. If you're in a class discussion, you might be thinking, is this good enough? Or would this sound better if I ran it through an AI? Something like that. And that kind of thinking can make it really hard to trust your own judgment over time, or develop the skills to make your judgment good enough. And that's especially relevant in something like English. Like I said a minute ago, definitely like classes where there always is not a single correct answer. And part of the skill is learning to make your own interpretation and kind of stand by it and defend it. And if you're constantly comparing that to something generated or suggested by a tool, it can make your own work feel much less solid, even if it's actually good. And I think this also ties into the idea of effort, because writing well usually takes time, and not just in the sense of sitting down and writing or typing, but in the sense of thinking through ideas, making mistakes, revising, gradually improving, and so on. And if that process gets shortened too much, you might still complete the assignment, sure, but you're not getting the same level of practice out of it, which can matter a lot more in the long run than your grade itself. And at the same time, it's not realistic to expect people to completely ignore these tools either, because now that they're becoming more common, more integrated into everyday tasks, all the companies are having their own AI version of whatever they're doing. They all have their this, AI that. The question isn't really should they exist or not, but it's more like about how they're being used and how that shapes the learning experience, rather than completely controlling it, rather than taking the front seat and not letting anyone actually learn anything. And that's where things are kind of unclear, because we're in this in-between phase where the technology is moving quickly, but the way we think about it in education is still very far behind and trying to catch up. So, like myself, you probably end up with a lot of mixed feelings where people can see these benefits, they can see them, but also feel like a lot of important things might be getting lost in the process. And for me, especially looking at it again from an English perspective, the biggest concern isn't that AI will replace writing exactly, but that it might make the act of writing feel less necessary in a practical sense, even though it's important for developing how you think and communicate in your life. And that gap between what's useful in the moment and what's valuable in the long term is kind of where most of the tension comes from. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it, because it depends a lot on how individuals choose to use these tools and how institutions decide to adapt them. But it's definitely something that changes the experience of learning in a way that's hard to ignore once you start paying attention to it. I've had a bunch of friends using AI to help them solve quizzes, help them do tests, help them whatever they have to do. It's pretty much the same people that always used Google growing up, and now this is just a more advanced version of using Google, because instead of looking things up on Google and finding the closest matching answer, you can go and ask AI and it'll give you an exact match to the question that you're asking. Even if some of the time it pushes out a lot of incorrect information, a lot of times the information can be right. And that's also kind of another issue with AI, is that it can still put out a lot of misinformation. I've actually seen AI put out other AI sources, and it's literally just feeding off of itself. It's literally AI sorting AI sources, and it's all just like a bunch of misinformation, but it just feeds off itself, and it kind of continues to sprout out more and more false information. So that's also becoming kind of an issue, especially with Google's AI overview feature. Sometimes when you look things up, it'll give you a completely wrong answer. And this has happened to me personally a bunch of times, and I wish it was kind of an optional thing that you can turn off, and it very well could be, I'm not sure. But it does bother me to look something up and get a completely wrong answer in the AI overview, and then I have to look even further down my search results to actually find a solid answer. It's just slightly less convenient, and I feel like they should wait to put something like that in until AI gets a lot better. Overall, I'm just a little bit nervous about AI as an English major because these things are learning language models. They literally deal with English and other languages, and it's just a little bit nerve-wracking because there's already been times where people are getting accused of cheating when they haven't. Some professors are using AI programs to detect AI, so it's just AI to look for AI. And sometimes those have false detections, and that can lead to someone getting a 0 or getting a bad grade or whatever it may be on something they did well on. And that kind of thing just bothers me because AI is not really a great thing in English right now. It's causing a lot of issues, and it also has a ton of issues in the environment and a bunch of other places. But hopefully we can find solutions, hopefully we can find a good balance, and hopefully we can find ways to figure out this whole mess. But as of right now, it is a little bit messy.